Hello everyone, Revan619 here. I hope you're all doing really well. For those viewers in the UK, I hope you're also managing to survive the heat. It is insufferable where I am down south right now. However, I wanted to talk today about Heinrix. Heinrix has probably the only build where I suggest an early game respec. The reason is, for Act 2 and most of Act 3, you'll be using the Zarkovian soldier armor. The wearer becomes immune to toxin and cannot fall prone, being pushed away or staggered. Additionally, their dodge penalty is reduced. The benefit, however, which is meant to be a negative, the material of this armor is made of extremely flammable. If the wearer makes all tests remove burning with -5 penalty and suffers double burning damage, and upon taking fire damage suffers 6 levels of burning. We can abuse this as a pyromancer, and what we do is when we target ourselves with a ignite, not only do we gain warp fire, we also gain regular fire dots. So we can actually stack 2 fire dots, which we can then boost with orchestrate flame to add to our melee, and then we can boost even further with inflame. However, some people might not like the look and they might be unhappy that the stats look low, even though this is the highest damage dealer in the game. So they might want to, for Act 3, respec to power armor, and that way that they can get some slightly beefier stats in here, and they use the Adherent of Mankind. This is in some ways stronger because your stats higher, but in other ways weaker because obviously you lose access to 2 fire dots that you can also stack into your melee, and both of them can get increased by inflame. So if you do want to respec that later in the game, that is going to be up to you. And when it comes to talking about Ellie Medi build, I would be remiss if I didn't explain to you that the strongest possible setup you can get is Invigorating Resolve. For those of you who don't know what Invigorating Resolve does, it's a very OP little item that whenever the wearer and allies in a 2-cell radius gain momentum, they also gain the same amount of temporary wounds. You can very easily stack up 1,000 temporary wounds on the first turn. You then combine that with an item called the Malpian Shroud. What this bad boy does is whenever the wearer deals damage, it gains temporary wound damage. So this will use all of those excess ones. This is not limited to Abelard, even though everyone seems to think only Abelard can use it. It's actually the most biz setup for any melee. And then you just throw on something like the well-maintained Rocksaw. The reason you use that is it is a multi-hit weapon. So what this one will do is, each attack with this heavy Rocksaw will basically stack damage. So each attack of that will have both your fire dots, it will have all of the extra damage of the Malpian Shroud, it will incredibly build up Invigorating Resolve as long as you've had allies building up your resolve. And yes, you'll have multiple ways to stack your crits for fire damage from Dogmatic 2, the Biophysical Distortion will apply multiple times, and the Bleed will apply multiple times. You then put on the Void Veteran boots, and on kill you get infinite numbers of charges. However, this isn't really a build, it's just using the passive of Executioner with some of the early stuff of Warrior, and the reason I don't recommend it is it's not enjoyable to play because it's just stacking buffs, and I'm not a guy who's known for trivializing the game by just stacking buffs. I'm not a Wrath of the Righteous player. I'm someone who likes to create interesting gameplay, so I'm going to break my rule of no gameplay being shown in the early videos, just because I want to show you what a Heinrix turn looks like with the setup that I'm going for here, and then you can decide for yourself if you just want to stack OP items and apply buffs, or if you want to actually use a build. My lovely assistant Eogun here has given a Grand Strategist Chrono's buff loop to Heinrix, who is then going to get to use 0 AP buffs himself using the power of the Spirit Drape. One of the reasons we need to increase his stats here is also so he can get the full benefit of his armor, so you want to apply the Iron Arm before you apply the other things like your Self-Ignite and then your Orchestrate Flames. This is going to be due to the augments in use here, and I will discuss that more in the augment section. So what I am doing with Heinrix is I have one of the chains that you can grapple onto enemies and bring them to you. Those early hits can then generate MP from items like the inertia boots, and then you can just start moving around and generating a lot of attacks and a lot of damage. You can use Heinrix's hook to be able to get off attacks when you've already used an attack, and if you use the one that costs only 1 AP, you can then use that with Shearing Strikes to attack a lot of economy. Why I like to use Shearing Strikes is, with some of the augments, as you can see here, you can chain additional effects on every hit. So every hit will actually deal damage to enemies, and it will apply from the augments like the Toxin Arms. We have the Galvanic Carapace. We'll be able to apply effects from the Grappling Hook Arms. We'll then be able to combine that with items, and the number of Shearing Strikes will also combine with our Executioner. And if we have enemies at range, instead of using a Rocksaw, we can use Where It Hurts with our Pyromancy Staff, which whilst it counts as a melee item and it also gets all the melee talents, it will actually 3 times damage proc for all the fire stops because because of where it hurts. So as you can see, we just get to stack up a crazy amount of things, which is just a lot more fun than just infinitely charging around, because the Void Veteran charge boot setup can be used by any melee character. It can be used by Cabela, it can be used by Heinrix, it can be used by Abelard. It doesn't create any build variety, and I do like my builds to play a little bit different. Having a Shearing Strikes Executioner Heinrix just gives different ways that you can play, and it's kind of why I like to set him up this way, because it is different to the other setups and what they do. And because you can add on stuff like the augments here, then obviously not being a single strike attack, you can use it here, which you wouldn't be able to do with the Rock Sword because it's a burst attack, so you wouldn't be able to get off all these little extra lightning hits or even take advantage of the EO gun. When it comes to Heinrix, I recommend doing any augmentation that you want to do into Act 3 because the negatives on them are quite heavy, besides maybe the optical insertion. So one of the ones that I really like on many melee builds is the focal emitter. So this means after any attack you do, you get another attack which can be stacking more of your dots. So having this early means you have another sources of attack that will get your dots in, well, quite useful. One of the other good ones is the numeric assault grapple. Now the MK Warrior one will allow him to attack with both weapons, so in Act 3 the MK Warrior is going to be the better one, but in Act 4 just getting the -1 AP cost, because you're going to one-shot things, it's better to go to the MK2 variant. As for the phase oscillators, again, an Act 4 upgrade, because you move around so much, just using this with his slash will just increase damage. So it's another way to get a little bit more damage. And then of course slash will also stack with something like the focal emitter. But the one that I would recommend very early is getting on the relic one, because that will add toxin damage, and then eventually upgrading it to the Chymist combat infuser, because stacking more ways of getting more toxin on Heinrix will be a big power creep. One of the other ones that Act 3 or Act 4, if you're going to use it, is the Galvanic Carapace. The reason I don't suggest in Act 2 is because whilst your toughness is a little bit lower, before you get to 90 toughness, it will reduce your armor effectiveness in combat, and the user's armor cannot be more than what this sets it as. So early on, this can be a big detriment, but in the later game, Act 4, when you're not going to be receiving acts, you can go for it. So the only one of all of these that I would even recommend in Act 2 would be the Relic one, which is going to be the weaker version of the Chymist combat infuser, and obviously the focal emitter MK1. Otherwise, you want to upgrade the MK2 or the MK Hunter, but be aware that the MK Soldier can only be used at range. Unfortunately, Heinrix cannot use the Skull Crushers, which is biz for any of these sort of melee variants that you can use, but you do want to be able to galvanize something to be able to use it for the perks that we're going to be taking in some of the talents. So for newer players, we've talked a lot about what Heinrix is and what he does, and I've even shown off a little bit of combat, but I haven't really explained the basics. So basics is Heinrix is a warrior. Story-wise, he is a Inquisitor Interrogator, and he comes with two Psycher schools, that of Biomancy and Santic. Whilst we're not going to build much for Santic until the end game, we are going to build heavily for Biomancy and then even dip into Pyromancy to go into Executioner, so we can do multiple dot damage. The way this build works is every hit he does, he will apply some status effects that do damage over time, and every additional stat after the first one will instantly proc instead of waiting to the enemy's next turn, and it will do some exceptional damage. And that's how Executioner works. And again, it's why people prefer the Rock Sword, because per one attack you actually do 4 attacks, whereas here we have to find some creative ways to get multiple attacks. So yes, we're creating more extra work for us, but I found it to be something a little bit more enjoyable. From the augmentation, he does get the forced couple to enemy, so he can deal damage to enemies, and he pulls himself in towards the enemy, and then he'll go for a melee attack. Using the MK Warrior, he'll actually attack with both of his swords. Much like with this, we will be taking abilities like Slash. What Slash does is it gives us, well, Slash comes from Breakthrough, and what Breakthrough does, it gives us the Slash ability. This will allow us to move through an enemy, and then with the Shearing Strikes upgrade, we can attack with both of our weapons again. We're going to be using Special Force Sword that apply warp damage on top of his other dots. So for Executioner, he'll add Bleed, which we can stack with some special gloves for more bleed. We will then, from crits using Dogmatic 2, we will apply burning damage. Using Biophysical Distortion, which comes from his Biomancy as a passive, all of our attacks will apply Toxin, which will also stack with a Toxin arm on our main hand, but not our offhand. And then lastly, we will be using the Warp Fire on top and the Fire from the Dogmatic 2, as previously said. So we have 4 dots. So there's a lot of damage we can do. With the first Grapple Hook, we'll be able to do 2 attacks. With Slash, we'll be able to have depending on what our agility is, multiple instances of moving through enemies to have multiple attacks, and then we'll use our main attack to either ignite ourselves, which will add to all of our attacks extra burning damage when we follow up with Orchestrate Flames, which we can enhance even further with Inflame, as I did in the start, or you could use, say, Hammer of the Emperor where it hurts, and then use a big attack on your Pyromancy Staff to have a ranged damage. As much as I badmouthed Rock Swords, the Pyromancy Staffs essentially work like a ranged Rock Sword attack, which did get nerfed in this patch when people think they got fixed. Pyromancy Staff powers have always counted as melee attacks, gained melee stats, and scaled from melee stats. Everyone complained about this, so they took away the melee stat scaling. So it's still a melee attack, but you just don't get weapon skill to crit chance, and you don't get strength damage. Congratulations, nerfers. So, for those of you that are also still new to the channel, if you've caught through my little rambling so far, in the description you will find my build spreadsheet, where I create build variants for every character in the game, as well as build options for your rogue trader and your main character. These videos are meant to be watched alongside using that to follow for level ups, but these videos are going to explain how everything works. Now, normally I do show act-by-act combat, but I'm trying to avoid spoilers for these first initial videos, and then when I start going on to Rogue Trader builds and more creative stuff, I'll be showing off combat spoilers. Rather than read through these one for one, I'm going to explain why he has them and why I like them. So rigorous training is what comes to Heinrix by default, and if you want to know more about charge and endure, I have already posted a warrior archetype guide which explains how that works and the examples around that, so I'm not going to repeat stuff from videos that I've already done. But what rigorous training does, it will allow him to still be able to move after he charges. So this will also apply to Slash, and now with the Shearing Strikes fix, it will apply to Shearing Strikes. So for me, one of the first most important ones is Desolation. This is so our melee attacks can scale from our agility damage, so buffs coming in from agility is going to do more damage. I prioritize weapon skill first, because that's going to be our, well, countering enemy parry, as well as our crit chance. And then the first ability I take is Breakthrough. Breakthrough will increase our attack economy. Whilst we may not use it very much in the early game, because we might prefer to charge, because charge and breakthrough are exclusive, it will be more useful when we start using attack economy to ignite ourselves and set ourselves on fire to increase our damage, which means breakthrough will allow us to attack and buff in the same turn. One of the things I progress next is our Psycher powers, as well as continue to increase our weapon skill. You can only increase attributes twice per tier of level. So if I did no weapon skill in tier 1, I could do 4 in tier 2, or I could do 2 in tier 1 and then 2 in tier 2. Or if I had done no weapon skill at all, you could actually do 6 in tier 3. But 6 is always going to be the cap, but it's going to be 2 per of the tiers going through. Psycho Minoris will increase our psi rating, which will increase the damage of our powers, and it will also increase how much our buffs do, as well as some other effects, and some other talents will work alongside of that to have some additional effects based on our psi rating. And one of the most broken game items that there is will actually scale directly from this to increase our attack economy during the first turn. Because we are going into Executioner, we need Medicae. Medicae will scale your damage, it will scale your health, and it will scale your armor depending on the talents you take, and there are some exceptional damage boosts that you can get from it. Because of this, I actually do take base and advanced skill Medicae to get another plus 20 Medicae, because Blade Dancer can scale their weapon skill to their Medicae instead of their intelligence. Warriors can't, so warriors have a big Medicae deficit, and this is going to be one way to help with it. Early game, you will use items in Act 2 to increase your Medicae, whereas by Act 3, Act 4, you don't need them as much because you start to catch up, but it's going to be one of those things that stacking Medicae is going to be exceptionally useful for this build. Shearing Strikes is going to be the rank 8 ability. This will allow you to attack with your offhand during your Shearing Strikes, which means that having Veil Render in your offhand for Act 1 to 2 and possibly even in Act 3 means that you can do a lot of damage, because Veil Render will increase the damage of your offhand attacks when you crit on the following attack. So if you get an offhand attack that crits, your next attack with Veil Render will have some huge boosts in damage based on the Veil degradation. The Daring Breach upgrade I take is the 4, because this is the MP generator, so it's very useful for me. Then I like to get Open Engagement. Not one I used to take on builds, but as you can see, this scales a lot of extra damage to your first attack in a round, as long as you don't already start with enemies around you. So if you open with a charge, or your initial slash, or even if you take that big Pyromancy Hammer of the Emperor where it hurts shot, this will be an exceptionally big damage boost to it. And yes, Open Engagement does apply to Pyromancy staves, and it should apply to every fireball, because it all counts as a single burst. Rank 10, I like to take strength because we're going to want to get Heinrix's strength up for heavy armor, and we kind of use it for all of our damages, though it's not going to be something I focus too hard on till the end game, because we can turn temporary HP into, well, not temporary HP, we can turn HP into strength via peak condition. So rank 11, we get pyromancy as our ability, because this will open up the passives from pyromancy and allow us to set ourselves on fire quite soon. Now at rank 11, this is, like I said, I take heavy armor efficiency here, but before Act 3 or during Act 4, you might want to spec Heinrix, which you can do at Danrock on your ship. You can change this to power armor efficiency. You don't see power armor till Act 3, and it's the adherent of the mankind, which is the best one. If you plan to give that to someone else like Abelard, then you want to keep this as heavy armor efficiency. It just means Heinrix will be a little bit more squishy. Power armor will essentially allow you to have more base strength damage, and it will allow you to have increased stats, whereas heavy armor will allow you to have improved fire damage to your melee. So you're going to want to test which you prefer and which look you prefer. Then we start increasing agility, because yes, agility, whilst it won't be very efficient for dodge, it will increase our damage because of desolation. Heinrix also gets quite a bit of bonuses to Lord Xenos, so you can either choose to increase athletics here, or you can choose to increase Lord Xenos. For the purpose of the run with the party that I'm running at, Lord Xenos is what I needed here, because with Lord Xenos I can run him alongside Abelard. If you take athletics, you're going to have to drop Abelard from the party. Rank 13, Body of Flames. So this one is going to be important so I can survive my own ignites, especially as you get willpower boost. You don't want to kill yourself when you're trying to set yourself on fire. And then I finish up going into more Psych Majoris to get that Psi rating up. And I also give Heinrix Shimmering Emulsion unless my main character is also a Psycher. This will allow Heinrix to have +3 into this. And then later when you take Blade of Light, it's going to be doing a lot more. I used to take Blade of Light earlier because it's incredibly powerful to up your damage, but if you want to be able to set yourself on fire immediately in Act 2, you're going to want to have this set up ready, so our next ability can go straight into Orchestrate Flames. If you're not planning to take Orchestrate Flames earlier, you can actually swap out Body of Flames to say Biophysical Distortion, but it all depends on the ordering of if you want to be the man that's on fire hitting things or not. So one of the things to consider is in your primary weapon slots, like I said, in the offhand you might have Veil Render until you can get to the Incinerator and the Curse Bringer into later acts. In the offhand, having that Veil Render to get the extra damage is going to be very useful. Other items that I find quite useful is Swashbuckler Cloak, because you can only have one Malpian Shroud. I have Malpian Shroud and Invigorating Resolve and Abelard, which means Heinrix also needs gear. Every build can't have every OP item unless you're going crazy with the cheats, so that's why I like to split them up to create complete party compositions rather than one person you buff with mercenaries. So for Heinrix, he's got the Star Mist Scarf, which means I'm not using Idra this run, so he gets +2 Psi rating there. The Swashbuckler Cloak will increase his weapon skill, which offsets some of the minuses that you'll be seeing on the hook arms, and the same with the Hand of a Voilist can come in now. But you could take the Augmented Gloves in Act 2 to get the increased weapon skill, so again, you're not hurting your weapon skill by giving him this little bionic arm. Early on in Act 2, once you have done the Janus line, you can get the Spirit Drape, which means during the first turn of combat, Psych Powers cost 1 AP less. This will apply to extra turns, so he will actually be really effective. Late in Act 2, you'll get the Warp Surge Brooch, which gives him Psi rating number of attacks during round 1. This is incredibly useful to pair up with the Inertia Boots, because that means his crits will give him AP, and he'll have a lot of extra attacks. Now, in Act 3, you can get the Hand of Offense, which will give him extra melee damage to both his staffs and his melees based on your Psi rating. But if you want to Spirit Drape buff, then that will actually hurt it, so you need to decide which of the two you want to use. Eyes of Joyce has been moved from Act 2 to Act 4, and this gives +2 Psi rating. Now, I like this because we've now got 9 Psi rating on Heinrix, which means that when he buffs, he'll do a lot of damage. When you switch to his staff, it'll increase his willpower and he'll do very good. Heinrix can buff his strength, his toughness, and his agility very well, so his willpower needs to be buffed from allies like Voice of Command, Cassius Reveal the Light, or potentially even Idra using Prescience if you go along that way. However, you very easily in the secondary slot could just put a Rock Saw and in Act 4 put the Void Veteran Boots, and then you steal the Malpian Shroud and you steal the Invigorating Resolve. And then yes, that is the version of Heinrix that can do damage into millions that caused me to get the Psycher's Breastplate nerfed. And because Psycher's Breastplate nerfed has happened, it's not as useful for Heinrix. It only triggers on perils now, not Psychic Phenomenon, which is why we either use the Sarkovian Chest or we use the Inherent of Mankind. Moving into the tier 2, this is where things start to get fun, because this is where Heinrix starts applying dots, and the more attacks he does, the more he does. That's why we can take the grapple arm warrior to get 2 attacks there, but you're going to want to take that after you have the augmented gloves, not before. And rank 2, we take the orchestrate flames. This will add extra fire damage from our self dots onto our melee attacks, which now that we have body of flames, this is perfectly usable. And if you have the Zarkovian heavy armor, which you can get very early in Act 2, then you'll have 2 forms of dots that you can boost. Anatomy Expert is what my priority, because it turns Heinrix's Medicae to his HP, which will outscale his toughness. I then start increasing weapon skill, and then I get biophysical distortion quite early. We already have the toxin arms, but this will allow us to apply toxin on our off hands as well as our primary hands, and it applies more stacks based on our psi rating, so this will actually outscale the toxin arms. I don't know if they stack. Next ability I take is Inflame. This will increase our base damage of those fire damage attacks. Yes, our main damage is coming from dots, but a lot of enemies will now resist dots, so Inflame is now more valuable, and increasing our melee is more useful. And because a lot of bosses will resist our dots with the reworks in 1.5, Serve of Distress is going to be quite important to lower enemies' checks to pass it, so if you actually even want to have a chance of applying dots, this is also very important. And I would say by this point, the build's already online. The build really is online by like rank 2, and then we're just getting little power increases coming through, and that's because of augmentation. Before, it wasn't really online until you got this rank 6 here. At rank 9, I do take the training Perception, because Perception is an obscenely important thing because it decreases enemy dodge. For Act 3, especially if he's coming, you want this and you want to boost your Perception up. Then I try to start moving away from just increasing our base stuff to start enhancing what we have. So I get Sparks of the Grey Flame, which give us crit chance to our dots, which is a big power spike. For Carnival of Misery, I like to have the extra damage upgrade, and then I take the heal from dots upgrade in case, obviously, dots are applying to us, which will happen because enemies, if you're using the toxin arm, will explode. Master of Torture will give us a nice 5% per dot, so that will go up to 20% because we have 4 dots that we're going on there. At the moment, I've got some willpower increases here. Now, you can just go straight into Perception. It's optional. I've only done willpower because I wasn't taking him to Act 3. If you're taking Heinrix to Act 3, you definitely want Perception here. Then at rank 15, Shield of the Emperor, so I start moving into Santic ones. You could take Reckless Abandon to get some more damage from temporary HP if you really wanted to, but I like to give these massive buffs to the whole party, and this will stack as well as your psi rating goes up. So you will be getting a lot more from your psi rating and from your allies' resolve to their armor, so this one is really powerful. Psych Terminus, yep, increasing psi rating does more, and then we get Blade of Light. So at the moment, Blade of Light does more damage, and it gives us more armor penetration, so we don't really have to worry about enemies' armor. I've gained some more Perception in here, all-encompassing Agony, so yep, once we have all 3 dots up, we do another 30% on those dots, so that's going to be a 50% increase. More Perception, we get in some Medicae here, like I said, so you could put something else here, like Psycho Extremist, but I think starting to jump up the Medicae, because the more Medicae we have, the more like HP we have, so it is very useful to have, and it increases the checks, and it stops enemies from resisting our dots. And like I said, the last upgrade by the time of effect hit I like to get in here is that dots heal us. So that means when enemies are exploding and applying dots to us, and we have our own burn dots, we're not just going to die. But chances are you're always going to pick Daring Breach, because that is your turn 1 map clear. So it resets your turn, gives you basically movement on attack, enhances your damage by more strength, and you just go around just wiping out everything. As you get into Exemplar levels, it will either be as you're finishing Act 3 if you're on the base game, but if you have DLCs, you're probably going to be closer to level 40 than anything else going into Act 3. But by Act 4, you'll, no matter what, everyone's going to be here. So some of the useful ones, the first one I like to get is Degrade Defense. So this can be an extra 100% damage increase on all damage, and for all the party apply that. So Degrade Defense is very useful. I like to prioritize Easy Target. Now, if you were taking Firestorm earlier, you'd want Crowd Kill, because Firestorm will apply to crowd kill, crowd kill will apply to Firestorm, which adds extra strength to area damage, but this build doesn't use area very much. It's using a lot of single targets, though I don't know if crowd kill stacks with Eogun. I think he counts as a damage source. It's hard to tell because it doesn't appear in the combat log, but depending on what we see in the updates come Monday, which is when the Thursday of the 25th, the update has been delayed to Monday, so that Monday is going to be the 29th of June. We'll hopefully be seeing the fixes coming in, so we'll have to see how all that works. But anyway, I continue with with Medicaid, I pick up fragile playthings. There's a lot of form of armor strip we're going to build up in tier 3, and this is going to be Medicaid damage, and this is going to be a huge damage boost for us, and we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get the other stuff to that. But yes, continue weapon skill, again, advanced Medicaid, because that's quite important. Hammer of the Emperor will give us one really big hit, so like I said, when you go for that Inferno where it hurts, you Hammer of the Emperor just beforehand. That is going to be absolutely huge. At rank 5, this is where I get Destroy. You could also take Peak Condition here first and then Destroy it. It's up to you the order that you do it in, but Destroy will mean every melee hit will strip enemy armor, and the reason we use that is to combine it with Wrecking Weakness. For every 10% potential armor that enemies have had reduced, we get 6% extra damage. This stacks, by the way, so even if the enemies only have 20 armor and you've removed 20 armor, if you've potentially removed 200 armor, this will apply 20 times 6%. If you buff your Medicaid through ally stats, that increases, and so this is how I've done stuff like hitting over 1 million damage on Heinrix. Then I prioritize just getting the nice late game buffs, which you don't need for early, but is very nice to have. Stuff like more weapon skill, Hymns of Hatred, which will increase our critical damage by 1% for each source damage, Enfeeble, which will be another good damage increase here, which we can later take with Deterioration for even more damage, more agility, finishing off Psycher Extremist, because that's pretty good. Fire Within is actually really good, because you can get 3 attacks every time you get 8 attacks for crits or kills. I would like to take this earlier, but it's just really hard to fit in with how good everything else is. But yeah, then we finally get Peak Condition, so our wounds become strength, which is why Heinrix gets a massive strength increase even though we haven't been leveling it, so that means that our base melee damage is going to get some fairly good increases as well. Edge of Dawn, good 10% coverage, so we like to take that round to rank 11. Like I said, Crowd Kill, this could be swapped earlier, but it depends on how Eogun's buffs work with it, and if you take Firestorm instead of Inflame, or even Molten Beam. But then Relentless Blaze, so we get even more Psi rating, so we're going to have 10 Psi rating easily whilst we're the Burning Man. And then you can either take Willpower, Perception towards the end here. Perception will help with some of your execution of things, like your Scourge and Strikes, whereas Willpower will be just useful for when you're switching over to the Fire Staff. Extermination, because we're going to make a lot of attacks, is just good damage increases. Psalm of Heroes, again, as allies use heroics, our Psi rating will go up, which will boost all of our stuff. Melting Armor is another potential per hit. We can do 5% up to 20% enemy armor, so that will all stack with our other sources of like Destroyer and our Wrecking Weakness and Fragile Playthings. Deterioration, this applies to more than just Enfeeble, so anytime we get these increases, we'll basically have that applied again, so it's very useful to have. I take Residual Power because we can get our number of Ferrum stacks to percentage damage, so it's 5 times 6 what I've got on Heinrix, so it's a good percentage increase to base damage. It's just a nice thing to have. You could switch that out if you like. Finishing up with Warp Speed, Willpower. Eagle for Battle means we have more AP. This is potentially 4 AP for 4 more attacks in round 1. It applies on Finest Hour and your main turn, so not a priority. It used to be one I prioritized a lot, but that's when Degraded Defense used to go up to 1,000 damage. We don't need to make that many attacks anymore. Lastly, just Eternal Glory is just a very nice little boost, plus 5 to stats, 1 to resolve, and some other little bits as well as 1 to damage. But that would essentially complete the build. This is going to be pretty much all I need to cover on Heinrix. I've shown a little bit of the combat, I've talked about what he does, and if you just pop along the live stream, you can watch how I play him. As of the next live stream, I've finally managed to fix some of his things. Don't make the mistake I did and put the augments on early. Save his augmentation for Act 3 because the negatives are very heavy on melee. But I've been Revan619, I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you all around in the next video.